Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. It's Sunday morning and I'm sitting in the cinema room. I've got a slight change of angle because I'm a bit cash, sitting on the couch, and I'm going to talk about Doctor Who, even though it's not on the air at the moment and isn't likely to be on the air with new episodes for quite a little while. There's always stuff going on in the world of Doctor Who. That's why I do my occasional news from the Whoniverse section. But sometimes there are things you want to talk about that don't necessarily fit into a shorter video. A bit like last week's commentary on the possibility of new Doctor Who missing episodes being recovered. And thank you to everybody who's watched that video. It's so gratifying that so many people have watched it and so many people seem to have enjoyed it. I thought that today I would talk about the potential future of Doctor Who. This is a video I've been toying with making for a little while. I think I've even hinted at it a couple of times that I was going to do this. And in fact, in the spirit of transparency, I did record something 2 or 3 weeks ago, but it ran to about 45 minutes. I wasn't hugely happy with it because it was a bit all over the place. And these things tend to be like that anyway, because Doctor Who is a huge topic, very contentious, very difficult to maneuver around at the moment without attracting a lot of ire and anger and fury from certain confused corners of the internet. But I want to talk about the show today, and I thought I would do the video today because of a couple of things that have happened in the last couple of weeks, a couple of comments that have been made by people who have been involved with the series. One particular person who was involved in the series in its 1970s heyday. And the comments that they've made are quite interesting because they, one, suggest that the modern era of Doctor Who as we know it does seem to be over, and that there is change in the air for the future of Doctor Who, because I do believe Doctor Who has a future on TV. The BBC are in a very different position now than the position that they were in 1989 when they couldn't wait to get rid of Doctor Who, and it was a nuisance. It was a throwback to the 1960s. It was a show that nobody in the BBC was invested in or had any value in. And even though they made these vague promises that the Doctor will return, but it may be a longer wait for the next series to come along, and I think we've learned retrospectively that the BBC weren't against the idea of Doctor Who coming back, but they wanted somebody else to make it for them, somebody who understood the programme, which is pretty much where we found ourselves in 2005 when it did come back. And even though now the show is off the air, it finished in May or June, the latest series, BBC are making vague promises that TARDIS is going nowhere, Doctor Who will be on the BBC whether Disney are on board or not. Disney aren't on board. Disney clearly jumped ship. There are still people, I think, who possibly believe this line that's being spun, that Disney will make their decision after the spin-off series, The War Between the Land and the Sea, is aired, I think, in January. But that's clearly not the case, because if Disney wanted more episodes of Doctor Who, having screened 21 over the past couple of years, they would have renewed it long ago, regardless of the spin-off, because they know that shows like this take a long time to write and pre-produce and produce and edit and all that sort of stuff. If they wanted more Doctor Who episodes on air, they'd want them available as soon as possible. Even if tomorrow they said, yes, we want some more Doctor Who, it would be a good 18 months before we saw anything on screen. So let's forget the Disney element of this, because Disney aren't in the picture. And I know that nobody has announced this officially, because they won't announce it officially, I assume. All that will happen is that the BBC will say that they're working on some way to bring Doctor Who back. But Disney is out of the picture, so I think we can accept that that's the position that we're in. So we have Doctor Who in limbo, the show's rattling on with merchandise and audios and this series of repeats that the BBC are now showing on BBC Three from Matt Smith onwards, presumably because certain castings in the first 4 seasons are a little bit problematic in the light of things that have happened in the last few years. But what's interesting is, as I mentioned, a couple of people involved with the show have made telling comments about the history of the show. Most recently, in fact just last week, the latest issue of Doctor Who magazine, the official organ of BBC TV's Doctor Who, carried an interview with Rog Shearman. Rog Shearman, as you probably will know, he wrote the acclaimed 2005 Dalek episode, which was the 6th episode in the rebooted Doctor Who. Seems so long ago now. Well, it was 20 years ago. Wow. And he wrote that episode. I know there was a lot of behind the scenes tinkering and tampering and issues about the episode because First of all, the BBC could use the Daleks, then they couldn't, so they had to create something else, and then they came back, and the story was juggled around quite a lot, and it was originally based on an audio that Rog Shearman had done for Big Finish called Jubilee. Rob has now written a novelisation of Jubilee. He wrote an excellent novelisation of Dalek a few years ago, incidentally. He's now written a novelisation of Jubilee, which I think is based on that story, but has different parts to it. And also another audio he did called The Chimes of Midnight for Paul McGann's Doctor, which I do remember hearing, even though I'm not a massive Big Finish person. So he's written novelisations of these books, which I think have just come out. And he was interviewed in Doctor Who magazine, and I think he made some comments about the show which are interesting, even though Doctor Who magazine quickly jumped in to try and say, well, this isn't the official Doctor Who magazine line. But he did say, and I quote because I've printed it out, he said, I go through phases. I have a real push-pull thing with the show. At the moment, I'm in a pull phase. It's weird because the show is probably as dead as we've ever known it. Wow. After 1989, we had for years a current Doctor, Sylvester McCoy. Now everything that is ever going to be produced in Doctor Who terms is going to feel retrogressive. At least with the new Adventures and then the BBC books, you thought it's the current Doctor. The 7th Doctor, Sylvester McCoy, or the 8th Doctor, Paul McGann, when he regenerated in the 1996 TV movie. No one's going to start writing Doctor Who books with a Billy Piper Doctor, because no one knows what that means. In a funny way, the closing moments of the reality war seem to put a full stop on things. We didn't have that before. Where do novelists and writers and BBC books go with Doctor Who? Because they do publish new Doctor Who novels, a handful a year, and they feature Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor because he's the current Doctor. But he's not the current Doctor now. He is regenerated into Billy Piper. Now, that was a stunt, purely done to give the show a bit of oomph in the publicity department as it fizzled out of its last series, with no real plans about where that would lead the series. And I still think that's because Russell T Davies and his team knew early this year that the show wasn't going to be recommissioned by Disney and that there was going to be a huge gap before any more new episodes were made, which is why Ncuti Gatwa left, which is why the end of Reality War was compromised and rewritten so hurriedly. And just for the sake of a shock ending, they brought Billy Piper in to have the Doctor regenerate into somebody who looked like his earlier companion Rose. So we have no Doctor. Nobody, as Rog Shearman has said, nobody's going to be writing stories about the Billy Piper Doctor because we don't know what that character would be if there was ever going to be a Billy Piper Doctor. And I fervently believe that there isn't going to be. That's not going to be taken up. So I understand where he's coming from when he says that the show is as dead as it's ever been, because this particular era has closed itself off from being built upon by other creatives, other writers, comic strip writers and artists, novelists. There is no incumbent Doctor. If the show just ended with Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor drifting off into space, which is one of the things that I'd heard was the plan, if that had happened, we would still have Ncuti Gatwa as the current Doctor, and that would mean writers and comic strips and so on could carry on with that Doctor, but that's not the case. So any new Doctor Who fiction that comes along has to be backward looking. It has to focus on previous Doctors, if there's to be any more. I can't imagine that there won't be, because whether it's on TV or not, Doctor Who is still a decent moneymaker for the BBC. The merchandise ticks over. Obviously, it's not mass market as it was back in the Imperial phase of Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant, when you couldn't go to any shops without huge piles of character options, Doctor Who figures falling on you, and Doctor Who books on the shelves. It was a time that we possibly didn't appreciate as much as we should have. But it still makes money for the BBC, all the merchandise, the Blu-ray, the books, the licensed magazine, the licensing with Big Finish. It all adds money to the BBC's coffers. Obviously not as much as when Doctor Who was in one of its big popularity phases, but it is still a money spinner for the BBC. So they're not going to close down books and things. They're still going to encourage that sort of stuff, because as long as it's making the money, it's worth doing. But there is no current Doctor to proceed with. So whether the BBC books will say to their authors, well, tell us a previous Tom Baker story or a David Tennant story. I think there's a new audio thing with David Tennant's Doctor. They're always dabbling with the past of the show. But I do agree with Rog Shearman that the show currently just seems very dead, and it seems closed off in a way that it didn't in 1989 when it finished in 1989. Even though I'd been in despair of the show for several years at that point, there was this nagging voice in the back of my head that said that there was still so much potential in the show that it seemed to have been allowed to fizzle out when there was something there. And of course, I was proved right, because when he came back, it was a massive hit for a few years. I have to say now, I don't necessarily feel like that. I'm not saying that the show won't come back. I think it will. But at the moment, it does feel as if it's over. And it feels that it's ended in a way that doesn't encourage it to return. Because I think whoever takes over the show has got this issue about the Billy Piper thing. People always wonder what that means. But it does feel at the moment that Doctor Who is on pause. It just feels a little bit more than that to me sometimes. But I know that's not the case, because, as I said, the BBC still value it as a title. It is one of the big shows that the BBC has in its arsenal. And I think that these days, when big new hit shows are very hard to find, new dramas struggle to pick up large audiences. You very rarely get a drama which jumps and leaps and becomes part of the zeitgeist anymore. And Doctor Who has such a long tail in having been that. I don't think the BBC will throw out the baby with the bathwater, and they will want to bring it back at some point, but just not for a few years, because I believe that they feel that the last few years of the show haven't connected with the audience, and they would rather give it some breathing space so that the audience will feel fondly about it again, instead of ambivalent about it, which I think is how a lot of people have felt for the past 8, 9, 10 years of the show. I think it's sort of ticked over on the basis of the fact that there is still a residual popularity here, but I think that's dissipated to an extent. So I do agree with Rog Shearman that the show is as dead as it's ever been, but I don't necessarily think that it's completely dead. I will return at some point, but this is all a bit of a ghetto, because part of me says, yeah, it's dead. Part of me says, it'll come back. And I think I do feel that it has a future, but for me personally, it's had the future that I wanted when it finished in 1989. It had this huge resurgence, which in a way feels like a full stop now. It feels as if, well, it died, but it came back to life and it was great. But now it's dead. It's, you can be in two minds about these things. I don't want Doctor Who to die. I love Doctor Who. I've been watching it for 60 years, and it's so embedded in me now, even as I'm creaking towards infirmity. I'll always watch Doctor Who because I love it, and it's part of what I am, and it's one of the reasons I do this channel. And I've loved a lot of the new series, even though there was a large period in the middle which I didn't really much enjoy. I always stuck with it. So it appears to be dead at the moment, and it's hard to argue against that view that Rog Shearman has expressed, because there is no Doctor Who in production at the moment. There is no new Doctor. Nobody is planning to make new Doctor Who, and that's the first time that's happened since 2003, and it seems very weird. The other point I wanted to cover, which I want to spend a bit of time talking on, bearing in mind I'm already in 15 minutes, are some comments made by no less a personage than the great Phillip Hinchcliffe, who was the producer of Doctor Who back in the mid-70s when Tom Baker took over. I've referred to him several times in previous videos. Sorry for the paper rattling. He produced Doctor Who for Tom Baker's first 3 years, Tom Baker's finest 3 years, and he and his script editor Robert Holmes made the show more mature and more sophisticated and aimed at a slightly older audience. I think I referred to this recently in my Horror of Fang Rock video. Phillip Hinchcliffe had planned to do a 4th season and then step aside, but because of a certain fuss that was made about the more adult content of the series, he was removed from the show and replaced with a slightly milder producer who allowed Tom Baker's comedic instincts to come to the fore, and the show became a little bit more juvenile. Phillip Hinchcliffe, however, not only is he the last living original producer of classic Doctor Who, he is a very intelligent and creative person. He's retired, long retired now. I think he's about 80. But he attended a BFI screening of Terror of the Zygons from season 13 of Doctor Who, widely regarded as one of the very best seasons of Doctor Who. I think I'd put it right behind John Pertwee's first season as the very best of classic Doctor Who. That's coming out on Blu-ray a couple of weeks' time. Very much looking forward to that, and of course there'll be coverage of that here on this channel. But he was at the BFI for a screening of Terror of the Zygons, which has some new special effects and model effects and so on. And he was talking about Doctor Who, and he made comments about it, which actually resonated with thoughts that I've had about the show over the past few months. And he was saying that he thinks that the future of Doctor Who lies in looking back into its past, the way it was made in the past. Since it came back in 2005, it's adopted this 45-minute episode model that was very popular on American television in the early 2000s. American network TV particularly would have episodes that ran for that length, and they would add advertisements that would make it up to an hour. 45-minute episodes, bang, 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 you get in, tell the story. You might have arcs and so on threaded throughout the season. But it was individual episodes, and I think Russell T Davies very wisely picked up on the popularity of that format when he brought the show back, and I think it stood the show in good stead for several years. But that's not really the way that TV works these days, because the American networks have lost a lot of their power. Streamers have different models for TV shows. Classic American shows would have 22, 24 episodes each and every year. Now, with streaming shows with their higher production values and longer production runs, you get 8 episodes or 10 episodes every 2 years. And the old 45-minute episode format seems old-fashioned. And of course, the last 2 series of Doctor Who through Disney, we have had 8 episode runs of Doctor Who in line with other Disney shows and other streaming shows. I think that model of 45-minute episodes is tired, but I don't advocate doing the streaming model of having these shorter seasons with longer episodes, because the Disney episodes tended to be 45, 50 minutes. So we didn't get longer episodes, we just got shorter seasons. I do think that Phillip Hinchcliffe's comments, which I'll come to in a moment, are very sensible. And it is an interesting way to look at Doctor Who by going back to what made it work in the old days. And he says, Doctor Who stories should be told in 100 minutes. That's a very good time for a movie or a television story to be told in 100 minutes. That gives you room to introduce characters, to unravel an inciting event of the story, the mystery, what's going wrong. You've got the time to get to know the characters, to invest emotionally with the characters, not just the heroes. And there can be plot reversals and suspense. Doesn't have to be action all the time. To try and tell an interesting story in 50 minutes is very difficult, he continued. I would want it to be of that length, 100 minutes, because if you're watching something, you want to invest in the supporting characters, not just the Doctor. Gives you room to tell the story, so that would be my main point that I think would benefit it. So what he seems to be advocating there is something which I think is an experiment which might be worth trying again. 100-minute Doctor Who stories. And I don't mean 100-minute Doctor Who episodes. I mean the traditional 25, 30-minute episodes split into installments across 4 weeks, going back to that old classic Doctor Who format. When the show returned in 2005, I embraced it, as so many of us did. I love the 45-minute episodes. I love many of those single stories. And it's interesting that I do think that initially the show managed to balance that idea of the Doctor and the companion, plus supporting characters, plus additional characters within the story. And you did get character development. You got all that going on, as well as the main plot, the main action-driven plot. That seems to have been lost in more recent years. We've had some good 45-minute episodes. Even in the last series, there were at least 3, which are as good as anything that the modern series has done. And I'm talking about Lux, The Well, and Lucky Day, which I think were great standalone episodes that did have some interesting other characters apart from the Doctor and companion. So I think it can still work. But just think, if things like The Well, for example, had been 4 episodes, you could have spent a lot more time building up the mystery of the creature and the links to Midnight. You could have built up the supporting characters and done little side things with them. Would have had more time to breathe and move and really develop that sense of dread and creepiness that was an important factor in that story. But when the show came back, I wouldn't watch old Doctor Who for a while because it seemed old-fashioned and creaky. And this faster-paced Doctor Who, 45-minute episodes, bang, 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 get in, get on to the next one. It was so invigorating and refreshing and different for Doctor Who. Now we're at this point where Doctor Who is as dead as it's ever been. Looking to any potential future, I honestly think with the advent of streaming and all these shows that have different lengths, and there are a number of shows on streaming services that do have 25-minute episodes, mainly comedies, but there are a lot of genre dramas I've seen over the past few years which have had episodes of varying lengths. There are a couple that I've seen which have had episodes as short as 20 minutes, and then they'll have 40 minutes or 30 minutes. The benefit of streaming is that the makers of the shows can tailor the episodes to what that episode needs. I think for a mainstream show, you'd need to have a more standardized length of episode. But the fact that the streamers can run shows that will have shorter episodes means that the audience can embrace the idea of shorter episodes. It doesn't all have to be 50 minutes. Last night, I sat down to watch an episode of Alien Earth, which I'm finding a slog, to be honest. Episode 6, I think. And it was an hour long. It felt like 3 hours. I thought it was never going to end. I'm not in love with that series anyway, but it was so sluggish and so torturous. and you think you could pace this up a bit. You could really knock this down to 40, 45 minutes, because I felt every minute of it being dragged kicking and screaming out of me. So I think that for Doctor Who, going back to its classic format is something that could be worth trying. The only issue would be that, as all British TV dramas now are an hour long, it would be hard to schedule Doctor Who and to give it the importance it deserves. Would you put it back on a Saturday night at 6 o'clock for half an hour? Is it going to get lost in the schedule? Bearing in mind that schedules and ratings on terrestrial TV are all over the place at the moment. It wouldn't be easy to schedule a half-hour adventure series, but just think if we went back to doing 20 half-hour episodes with 5 4-part stories, which would give all those stories a chance to breathe and build and develop slowly and introduce its characters, have the Doctor and his companion or companions or however you want to do it, and just let that develop organically across 4 episodes without the need to rush headlong towards a conclusion. Because you do feel with every modern Doctor Who episode, as it starts, it's got the ending in sight, even before the credits have started, because it's just got a rush there. And it got a 4-part story, and there were always issues with 4-part stories that part 3 would sag. But I'd love a bit of sag in Doctor Who at the moment. It would be such a blessed relief from the hysteria and the manic pace of these things. So I support Phillip Hinchcliffe in that idea of, I think the future of Doctor Who may lie in looking back at what made it work in the past, because I think it's exhausted the potential of the current production model and the idea of single 1 or 45-minute episodes. And I know that the show's always had these underlying arcs and threads and so on, but even that feels tired now. It was unusual when we had Bad Wolf and we had Torchwood and Mr. Saxon and all this stuff in the first 3 seasons. But it's become increasingly laboured and increasingly uninteresting. And the ones we've had in the last 2 series, and again, it surprises me from Russell T Davies, who always had his finger on the pulse of these things. The arcs of the last 2 series just fizzled out and didn't really amount to anything. So I do think that Doctor Who can learn from its past, and I would like to see a new producer come along and think, well, let's try to do this. Or even if we have 2-part stories, it just gives more room, potential for the audience to invest in the story, because it's not going so fast. Before I sign off on this video, just a couple of other thoughts. These are things that have been rattling around in my head, which are things I was going to discuss in this video if I'd done it before all this spurred me into it today. In terms of who produces Doctor Who, we've had this concept of the showrunner, which has come in the 21st century in the wake of people like Chris Carter and J. Michael Straczynski and Joss Whedon, who were showrunners of big genre shows in America. And that has been adopted. I don't think it's an officially recognised industry term in the UK. They're still executive producers, but they are known as showrunners because the genre seem to encourage the use of that word. But I think any new showrunner or executive producer of Doctor Who, I would love somebody to come on board who is a producer of drama, a television producer with an interest in science fiction, fantasy genre. Not necessarily, though, somebody who is marinated in the history of Doctor Who, as Russell T Davies, Stephen Moffat and Chris Chibnall were. People who, although I often doubted it in terms of Stephen Moffat, know Doctor Who like the back of their hands and know the ins and outs of it. I would like somebody to come in who has watched Doctor Who and knows about it and knows about the Doctor and the TARDIS and the Time Lords and all this stuff, but is more interested in telling great stories. Because I do think that the show has, as has always happened with Doctor Who, become bogged down by its 60-year history, the Time Lords and the mythology of ancient species and Omega and Sutekh and all this stuff that's suddenly resurfaced recently. I would like a new producer to come on board who knows about Doctor Who but is more interested in storytelling and good ideas, great ideas, exciting ideas, scary ideas, high-tech ideas, who's not interested in bringing back some old relic of a character from the 80s. Nobody but the hardcore remembers. You have to aim at the bigger audience. I know this is always a big thing with the fans feel let down. You've let down the fans. Aim this at the big audience, a wide audience who don't care about what happened in 1965 or 1986. They want to watch an exciting story now with the characters they're watching now. Doesn't matter what happened 50 years ago. They're not interested in that. They didn't see that. If they did see it, they've forgotten it. They don't care. Fans love all this sort of stuff, though. But that's what Big Finish is for, frankly. I'd never wanted to see the Rani again. When she came back, it was a good performance by Archie Panjabi. But you sort of think, this doesn't mean anything really, because it's a character from an era of Doctor Who that wasn't popular anyway. And what can you do new with a character like that? And Sutek and Omega, these characters who were of their time and didn't need to be reinvented, certainly not as big CGI dog monsters. So I want a producer to come in who wants to make an intelligent science fiction drama for all the family. And I want a producer who's not afraid of certain things. There was this timidity about the show that would never show blood and never show the consequences of violence. And I think you do need to go down that road a little bit. I'm not suggesting buckets of blood flying all over the place, but I do think that if people are injured or hurt or shot, you need to see the effects of it. Otherwise, kids watching are going to think that violence, there's nothing to violence. You know, somebody gets shot and they've knocked over and they fall on the floor. That's not what real life is like. And I'm not saying, as I said, you have to have extreme, gratuitous gore. But if somebody is shot, you should see blood coming out of them. You should see the injuries that they have. I go back to the episode The Well, which was fantastic. But you had these scenes of this invisible creature throwing people across the room and hitting walls. But you never heard the crunch of bone or twisted bodies afterwards because something violent was done to them. You need to see the effects of that. Not in a gratuitous way. It can be done in a way that shows the audience, which can include children, that violence is nasty. And a lot of the stuff we've had more recently with Russell T Davies, this nonsense about Davros in his wheelchair, sonic screwdriver not looking like a gun. Let's forget all that sort of stuff. Let's give the audience credit with some intelligence. The audience really doesn't look at people in wheelchairs and think that they're evil. Children don't look at a stick and think it's a gun. It's a peculiar form of gatekeeping that we need to forget about now. Let's move on from that. We tried that and it didn't work. Let's forget about it and let's be realistic. So I want a producer who wants to tell good stories, who doesn't have a brain pulsating with 60 years of Doctor Who that they can't resist plundering now and again. Let's do that. Let's get somebody on board who wants to tell a good dramatic series first. And how it connects with Doctor Who's past is a distant consideration. So, having said that, I can hear you all saying, Mr. Paul Mount, Mr. World of Stuff, what sort of Doctor Who stories would you like? What sort of Doctor Who tales would you envisage in this new magical world of Doctor Who that you're fantasizing about? Well, I'll tell you. I've always liked the Doctor Who stories that have a foot in reality, which is why I do like the Earth-based stories. I love that Jon Pertwee period when he was exiled to Earth and working for UNIT and the threats came to Earth or from under the Earth occasionally. Mad scientists, experiments. All those stories set in great big complexes like Inferno or Stangmore Prison in Mind of Evil or the Newton Power Complex in Claws of Axos. All those stories that dealt with sort of technology. And I think you could do sort of a Black Mirror-y sort of vibe of stories again now with the Doctor on Earth occasionally dealing with the modern world and AI and technology and all those sort of issues. Those are the sort of socially aware stories that Doctor Who can do, because I know people get a little bit worked up about the other sort, but Doctor Who could show its awareness of the world, because that's what science fiction does. It shows a mirror up to the world that we live in. And of course, Charlie Brooker's mirror is black and looks at the dark side of things. Doctor Who can do that, but possibly in a more optimistic way. So I understand, of course, we've got Doctor Who's an adventure in space and time. The format of the show is to go anywhere and any when, and I wouldn't want to abandon that. But I did like Russell T Davies's approach to doing stories set on alien planets, that there was some human element, whether it was a colony or explorers, and it was gritty and greasy and oily and dirty. And I do like that aesthetic of a tough, inhospitable future on tough, inhospitable planets. And I like that sort of vibe to the stories. And again, having said that I like the early Pertwee stories, I would like stories like that again, where the Doctor's on Earth and investigating something, where there's some scientific thing which is happening, which is threatening humanity, threatening the human race, or involving aliens. Grounded and realistic. I like Doctor Who when it's now in the real world, because that's my preference for science fiction. And again, it is all subjective. It's all my thoughts and preferences. Many of you I know like the space adventure stories. And I think when Doctor Who does alien planets well, things like the Peladon stories in the 70s, it's believable and it works. But when it doesn't do them well, I'm thinking of things like Time Lash and Horns of Nimon, it's very clunky and studio-based and utterly unconvincing. So it's very hard, even on the budgets available to TV today, to do really convincing alien planet stuff, because you're trying to create a whole world and a whole culture, and it's very difficult. And I think Doctor Who works best when it's doing what John Pertwee always used to say: the Yeti on the lewing tooting beck is terrifying because it's on your doorstep. So those sorts of stories, but more specifically, stories like Horror of Fang Rock, which I reviewed recently, based under siege type stories, where the stakes aren't galactic and cosmic. It's not the biggest, massivest, giganticest threat ever, and things will never be the same again. It's an intimate tale of a handful of people in danger. Terrible things happen to them. There's something monstrous stalking them. And again, that's a cliche in itself, but I think there are ways you can do it and put twists on it and really develop things, especially if you do have a slightly longer running time. You can pause for breath. You don't have to rush to the next spectacle. You don't have to run to the next massive CGI vista, because you can develop your stories and develop your atmosphere, make it smaller. And I think that's probably a motto I would have for Doctor Who: make it smaller. It doesn't have to be giant supervillains. It doesn't have to be creatures, gods. I think we've gone too far down that road. And I think the show has sort of lost a human connection with its audience because it's become too outlandish and too outrageous and just too big in scale. Let's bring it down a bit. Let's boil it down to the specifics of great adventures that don't always involve the universe being under threat, don't always involve some monstrous figure being brought back and rising from the darkness to threaten us all, and cataclysms and disasters. Let's keep it low key. Let's keep it a story about a few people in danger in a hostile environment. There are so many potential ideas there. And yes, as I said, it's a cliche. They are cliches. But Doctor Who is a flexible enough format to put a new spin on them. It did that in the past. I don't see any reason why it can't do it in the future. So on to finally the vexed question of the Doctor, him, her, themselves. I'm not going to go into the whole issue of gender and race and so on, because now it's clearly been established that the Doctor, when regenerating, can become a man or a woman and become a different race, physically, visibly. That door is now open. It's been kicked open. We can't close it again. But I think what we need for whoever plays the Doctor, whatever gender or race or whatever they are, it has to be a properly charismatic, magnetic actor. Somebody who you cannot take your eyes off. We had that with Tom Baker. We had it with John Pertwee. We had it with David Tennant. We've always had, or generally had, great actors who commanded the screen. Peter Capaldi, for all the fact that I didn't like most of his era because of poor stories, he was a beacon in those episodes, and he drove those episodes. He kept them afloat when they very often threatened to sink under a sea of bad ideas and poor writing. Once you've got your actor in place, it can work around them and the show can build itself around that actor. And you need somebody with that sort of presence. And what the show needs right now, is a Doctor. What it needs right now is another David Tennant. It needs that sort of champagne casting. David Tennant was a gift to Doctor Who. He was himself a long-term Doctor Who fan. He knew the show. He loved it. He is an actor because of Doctor Who. It was an ambition to play the Doctor, even though when the role was offered to him, he was a little bit reluctant at first because he thought it was too big an ask in a way. Thank God he did do it, because he gave us 3 stellar seasons. In terms of popularity, whether you like the episodes, whether you like him or not, you cannot deny that he was a massive success, and he brought a huge audience to the show. An audience that wouldn't normally watch that type of show. An audience that isn't used to watching that type of show. British TV audiences don't get a lot of mainstream genre television. When they do, it's dismissed as hokum. And it gets poor viewing figures because people have been conditioned to watch certain types of shows on British television because they're popular. And I'm not decrying those shows, but I'm just saying that Britain's imagination has been flattened a bit by not having this sort of show given to them very often in the last few years. Doctor Who is one of those shows, however, that does break through those barriers. It does cross over and can appeal to audiences who don't normally care about spaceships and aliens and monsters and science fiction gubbins, because it becomes relatable and it can become identifiable through your lead character. And if your lead character is as fascinating as Tom Baker as commanding as Jon Pertwee and as downright watchable and charismatic as David Tennant. Half the battle's won. So you need somebody like that again. I'm not going to suggest any names. There are a few actors that are in my head who would be very good. Shall I name them? I don't know. I mean, just as a off the top of my head, in a way, I suppose, I quite like Jodie Whittaker's take on the Doctor. She gave it a manic energy. What I liked about it was Jodie Whittaker's approach to it. She was having a fantastic time with some friends making this crazy show. She didn't know much about Doctor Who, and her performance is very clearly informed by having watched some clips of David Tennant, who she knew and had worked with on Broadchurch. But I didn't feel that her becoming a woman lessened or did anything different to the character. In fact, I think they underplayed it because her costume was fairly androgynous and they didn't bang on all that much about her being a woman. There were lines here and there, but it was very much the Doctor, and I did get the Doctor from her. So if we were thinking of casting another female Doctor, I would go for someone like Diane Morgan, who I think is absolutely brilliant in everything she does. She is genuinely quirky. If you watch her comedy series Mandy and things she's done like Motherland, and she's appeared in so many different comedy things over the years, but she is very unusual as a performer, and I think she could bring a real twist to that idea of the Doctor, whether they're a female or a male. I think she would bring something to it, a sort of a lightness and a darkness. I think that's probably there in her. In terms of other actors, people that I have noticed, I don't know that I want to go down the road with naming particular names. I think that Callum Scott Howells, who starred in Russell T Davies's It's a Sin, he may have the potential to develop into something Doctor-like further down in his career. And there are many others, but as I say, I don't really want to pin my colours to the mast in terms of who should play the Doctor. But whoever it is, whatever colour their skin is, whatever gender they are, it's got to be an actor who commits to the role in a major way and accepts everything that comes with it. And that's sometimes difficult because he's not just playing the role for 6 months making TV episodes. You go to the public appearance stuff. You got to do all the YouTube stuff. You're a face on a cover of a magazine and a book. It's not like any other show on British television. It's not like a detective show or a police show or any of those sorts of typical standard BBC, ITV dramas. It's a role that's bigger than television, and it carries a lot with it. You're the face of that character, and you're everywhere, on toys, on books, on magazines, and all. It's a big role, and you need somebody who will really embrace that and revel in it and bring something to it. But more than that, it's about the performance, and you need real charisma to play the Doctor. Again, there's issues about writing and so on, but I think you have to have an actor who's a bit larger than life and looks a bit more than human or otherworldly. And part of that is defined by the look of the Doctor. There's something else I want to touch on. I've mentioned this before. The Doctor needs a defined look. And the problem I had with Ncuti Gatwa, apart from the humanising of the Doctor, which I think needs to be dialed back somewhat, the Doctor needs a silhouette, a look. He dresses in a certain way. And one of the problems, as I said, with Ncuti Gatwa is he didn't have that look. Initially, we saw this look where he had this leather coat and these trousers, and I've mentioned this again. I think that was a good look for him. And he would drift in and out of that. Occasionally he would wear those clothes. But more often than not, he didn't. He was wearing T-shirts and leather jackets and trousers and kilts and God knows what. He just looked ordinary. He looked too ordinary. Now, Ncuti Gatwa is a clothes source. He could wear anything and make it look good. But he didn't look like the Doctor a lot of the time. He just looked like a bloke in the street, running down the street, stepping into a police box. He didn't look different and not one of us. And I think the Doctor needs to have that look. It doesn't have to be the costume look that came in the 80s when you had Peter Davison in his cricketing costume, his question mark shirts and Sylvester McCoy's jumpers and so on. You don't need that rigorous costume look. But I think you can have a Doctor who has a look that changes slightly. Jon Pertwee had his capes, frilly shirts, colourful jackets, frills. He had that, I think, the description at the time in the 70s that was used as this Harley Street Doctor. He can have that suave sort of look. And he did, but he didn't always wear the same clothes. He'd have a red jacket or a black jacket or a tartan jacket or a cape or variations on a theme, a look of clothes that the Doctor liked to wear. Similarly, with Tom Baker, you had that initial student-attracting bohemian look with the scarf and the slight bagginess and scruffiness. But that changed as well. He had a different coat, different waistcoats, different trousers. That look would vary. And I think you need that with the Doctor. You need a costume that is always a look, but not necessarily the same clothes. Certainly when Christopher Eccleston came, they wanted to move away from the idea of the Doctor's costume. But invariably, in his 13 episodes, he was wearing his leather jacket, a different coloured top. That was a defined look. David Tennant had a couple of different suits. So it was a look, but not a rigid, specified look of somebody wearing the same clothes all the time. But I think you need that in the Doctor. You need, for all sorts of reasons, not least for merchandisers, who need a look that they can pin their bit of merchandise on. The Doctor's got this hat or this coat or this scarf. That is something that ties this Doctor to the piece of merchandise they're trying to sell. And as I said, the Doctor himself as a character, less manic, less running around, a bit more thoughtful, a bit more detective, a bit more investigative, a bit less waving the sonic round like a magic wand that can do everything and solve everything. And I think that would come with slower paced stories. You'd have the Doctor being a bit more measured and not running around. He has to be somebody who is not one of us, but looks like one of us. But I think that the viewer and the other characters in the story need to know that this is somebody a bit different. He's not like us. He is, whether they know or think he's an alien. People in stories have to look at the Doctor as somebody commanding and powerful and knowledgeable, who is identifiable as a human but isn't. And people know that and they recognise and they appreciate and accept that. Less running round, less gobbledygook dialogue, less waving magic wands to solve situations. I go back always to that first John Pertwee story where he is an agent for UNIT investigating things that are going on in nuclear power stations, in space command centres, in huge factory units. He would come in as an outsider. People would recognise there was something a bit different about him, but by God, they respected him and they listened to him and they learned from his wisdom. And he used his skills to work out what was going on. It wasn't all just thrown at him on the screen. This is a situation, sort it out. He had to work things out and put pieces together, like a sort of a Sherlock Holmes figure. And I think, certainly in those two eras, I think Pertwee, particularly perhaps early Tom Baker, there was much more of the Sherlock Holmes about the Doctor than there is about this rather exaggerated God-type figure that the Doctor has become since the show came back. So those are my thoughts on the future for Doctor Who, which has spun off from Phillip Hinchcliffe's initial comments about longer, more languid storytelling, which I think the show is now ready for. I think we've gone as far as we can with this pell-mell rushing towards the credits that seems to be the standard for every episode. Now let's stop a little bit. I think people now are ready for stories that are a bit more immersive and a bit slower paced and a bit denser and just don't require this constant thrill of spectacle and bangs and flashes and jokes. And the Doctor needs to be a bit more serious as well. That's another sort of element. So this is all things that are just rattling around in my head and have been for a couple of weeks and have been crystallised a little bit by Rog Shearman's comments and Phillip Hinchcliffe's comments that became public in the last week or so, that made me think about what I would like to see for the future of Doctor Who. And again, as I said, it's purely subjective. It's my view. You may think it's a load of old toot. You might want the show to become much more adult and terrifying and all set in outer space or all set underground or all set in another dimension. That's the thing about Doctor Who. It is a broad church and it can tell so many stories in so many different ways. And what I like, what I might want for Doctor Who might not chime with what you want, which is why I would like to hear from you. Having sat through all this, and I hope it's not gone on for too long, I hope it's generated some ideas for you or got the creative juices flowing. So why not let me know what sort of things you'd like to see the show do when it comes back, because it will come back. I don't believe it's gone for good. I believe it's gone for a while because it needs to be. But when it comes back, I just think it needs these things that I've mentioned, a new creative team, a new vision for the show, different types of stories, and a more focus on the Doctor as a proper alien who is benevolent and beneficent, but is not one of us. No matter what he does, we always know that he doesn't belong to us or with us, but he does the right thing, the right way. So all this stuff is jumbling around in my head. So I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts. Let me know down below in the comment section your thoughts about what I've said. Is it a load of old toots? Might be. But let me know what your thoughts, your ideas for the type of Doctor you'd want, type of stories you'd want to tell. Do you think the 45-minute episodes is a perfect way to tell Doctor Who? Or would you prefer serialised, long-form stories over shorter episodes, a longer run? I think it would be nice to have a good 20-episode run of Doctor Who again, because these 8-episode seasons are gone like dust in the wind. So yeah, please let me know. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope I've not said anything offensive. I don't think I have. I think I danced around the issue of the Doctor's more recent incarnations. Please get in touch. Please let me know what you think. Like and subscribe to the channel if you're new here. I think it's something like 50% of my views are not subscribers. So just put that right by subscribing. It's easy to do. You can click that. You can click that with your phone, and then you're here. Thank you for watching. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking that stuff.